I'm Adam Paysse of Floodland Brewing, and this is the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest is Steve Luke, Cloudburst Brewing. He's here for a conversation that goes beyond the brew house and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. First, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media at allaboutbeer. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We'll get into the conversation in just a moment, but first, this message.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Falling temps and festive seasons are fast approaching, which means now is a good time to develop holiday stouts and brown ales using hibiscus and cinnamon from First Tee. Looking for other new ideas? You can find out more about First Tee's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttee.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog. Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropmaltingco.com to learn how Malteurop Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malteurop Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurop.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.
Okay, let's get into it. A bit about my guest today. Steve Luke started working in the brewing industry at the legally appropriate age of 21, sweeping floors and taping boxes at Allagash Brewing back in 2005. After brewing stints around New England and the Pacific Northwest, most notably Cambridge House Brew Pub, Rogue, and Elysian, he opened Cloudburst Brewing in 2015 in an old and crusty building just north of Pike Market. Among all his flashy accomplishments, 3 World Beer Cup medals, 10 GABF medals, plus a Brewer of the Year, and a James Beard Foundation semifinalist, he considers being friends with Adam Paysse one of his finer achievements. Steve Luke, when I texted you to ask you about doing this, your response was, "Is this how we finally get to have beers?" which I felt terrible about, but I thought was like quintessentially you.
Well, you know, we try to have beers a couple times a year because we live 3 blocks from each other. And it's always, both of our schedules are so unpredictable sometimes.
Yeah.
We have
we have 2 children between us, right? And 2 businesses.
Yeah. And you still have 2 dogs?
I don't. We have 0 dogs.
0 dogs.
Yeah. Very sadly, we're down to 2 cats and 0 dogs. Both of our dogs passed in the last, I guess it's been a couple of years, but yeah, sadly. So. Yeah, I know. Bummer. Yeah. It was early days of Floodland, and Nick, who now does Alma Mater Brewing, was brewing some work for us at Fremont Brewing, and one of my dogs fell and broke his hip, and he had bone cancer. Zeke, who was like my type. Yeah, and I was so sad about it that we didn't get another dog, and then our other dog just passed like last year. So 0 dogs in the Paysse household.
How we don't have one either, but I'm slowly wearing Holly down to become like a foster parent. So 2024 is the goal to like get dogs back into my life.
Yeah, I'm sorry, man.
But yes. Well, yeah, let's segue. What a bummer start of talking about past dogs.
Yeah, what happens when you put bummer Adam Paysse and like happy dude Steve Luke together? Apparently we found out. I kind of wanted to talk about, like, I didn't want to get too deep into how we know each other and our history, but when I was starting Floodland, I was making work offsite and using other people's brew houses and moving it back to my spot in totes. So my brewery would definitely not exist without the generosity of a very small number of brewers, including you. And one of the things I learned in running small businesses is that when you have these tiny business, you have no economy of scale that even slightly larger breweries, even breweries who are making, 5,000, 6,000, who are still really small breweries, they have some economy of scale. But these breweries, where you're under 3 or 4,000 barrels a year, and we're under 300 barrels a year. You have no economy of scale at all. And I just want to know what your approach is when you make business decisions like that, which is you have razor thin margins, and yet you repeatedly chose to go out of your way to help me out when you knew that it wasn't a business decision. It would provide you with no benefit to you, no benefit to your brewery.
Oh, yeah, I totally even like I forgot about like us milling grain for you.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, showing up with your truck and like having a partial pallet of grain and be like, all right, it's time to mill Adam's grain. And yeah, our grist case isn't really set up for it. So you're just like bag by bag, right?
Yeah, you guys would stop what you were doing and help me back a box truck in, and then I would unload all this grain. You would stop what you were doing to let me come use your mill. Like I was moving the grain, milling, because the spot I was making most of my work didn't have a mill. So I brewed, I mean, I think for a year and a half, I milled all of my grain at Cloudburst. And I just thought, like, why? Like, we're buds, but like, how is that a business decision? Like, what's your approach to running a small business that you even considered that? Because I think from a business standpoint, it was a terrible decision for you.
I guess so. I guess I've never really thought, I still don't think of myself as a business person or an entrepreneur or anything like that. Cause I'm just a brewer that has their own brewery, worked really hard to get there. But when we make decisions, I mean, helping you is easy. Like you've got genuine intentions. Like it's easy to help someone that you can just like see their passion, like behind what they're doing and like see their vision. And like, then that gets you excited about like, okay, like this is what Adam's doing. Like, this is pretty awesome. And it's hard not to like root for you. And for people that, you can kind of really like see that all the way through. Like they've got that passion and drive, they have the intentions, and then their execution on top of that is fantastic. Like there's not a lot of people out there that kind of start out of the gates with all those things going for them. But I think business wise, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, our margins are still tight, but we're still so small. There's 13 people on payroll, but maybe 4 to 5 are part-time. It's still me and one other person making work twice a week. There's 3 of us kind of in the brewery. Noah's still doing everything on the front side of things. So he's director of sales, but he's also our delivery person. He's the person pricing out COGS. He's the person emailing sales sheets, taking orders, inputting invoices, and then dropping the keg off, most days a week too. So we've learned to work within our means and put a lot of responsibilities on everyone's plate. But having a small team also allows us to like pay people for doing those extra things on their plate too. So that's kind of a rambling sidebar, but I know you and I have talked about kind of like, on that aspect of we're not business. I don't think you think of yourself as a business person either, but we also still look at making sure like that we are really good employers, right? Like I hope people like working, at Cloudburst, just like I feel like you feel the same way at Floodland.
Yeah, I think when you come from a background of being an employee and you become an employer, some people hold on to that, right? Some people hold on to their experiences, like what it was like on the other end of the spectrum or on the other end of that equation. And some people, I think it's easy to lose that when you start making much money. And if you're not making much money, it's probably a lot easier to hold on to it. But it surprises me that you don't think of yourself as an entrepreneur. I feel like maybe I don't think of my brewery as much. I think I'm always joking about it. I'm like, this is more of an art project than a brewery, but which is more meant to just sort of like poke fun at how bad I am at running it as a business, which helps me take me off the hook. But I mean, the amount of work that you had to go through to start Cloudburst was pretty staggering. Didn't at some point you have a change of how you looked at yourself in that process?
I mean, No, not particularly. It's I guess I compartmentalized it more where it's like I still think of myself as a brewer, and everything that I do as far as like the business from startup to now, it's like everything that I like really don't like doing that takes up time of my time. It's all like the things that I say I have to do just so I can continue to like make beer every week. So, I mean, like that's the reward is like, which sometimes you get lost thinking about why you did this. You know, the longer things go on, you're like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? Um, but still kind of coming back to being like, I love making beer. And so all this other crap I have to do week in and week out is just so that I can continue to like making beer, which I love to do. So I mean, like, yeah, you got to have some business savvy to like, stay in business for sure. I feel like I've just kind of like lucked out a little bit in a couple different aspects of it so that we don't have to worry as much about, the business side of things, so long as the beer still shows like, my love and passion like in it to week in and week out.
What do you think put you in that category of being a lifer? Like you were saying, you started in 2001. Like you've been basically been working in breweries your whole adult life at this point. Like what set you on that path rather than we see so many people who kind of come into beer and it is a trend and they get into it and then they get out of it and they move on to other things. Like what do you think what set the hook in you like that?
Oh man, I know I'm stuck now. There's nothing else I can do. So beer it is. Beer it was. Beer it will be. I think what started it. I mean, so like, yeah, I definitely found myself gravitating towards craft beer, in high school, just with just like different flavors. It's like we all had fake IDs, and instead of like grabbing your 18 pack of Natty Ice, it was like, what's this 6 pack of Sierra Pale Ale doing over here, and things like that. And then going to school in Maine, where like craft beer, like that craft beer scene in Maine, in the 90s was pretty strong. So into the mid aughts, it's like craft beer was kind of everywhere. It was like a normal thing, which I don't think, most places in the country really considered like all these different craft beer options around, their states like Maine had. And so yeah, first job at Allagash was such a great experience that I was like, okay, like I don't really know what I want to do, but I know that I had a really great time working for that brewery that I just was at. And maybe I should just kind of pursue this and kind of see where that takes me. Um, and I think, yeah, throughout, almost, well, yeah, almost 20 years in the industry, it's like I worked at some great breweries and I worked at some breweries that shall not be named for like 4 days or a couple months. You're like, why am I here? Like, what is this? This is not the experience that I was expecting, kind of a thing. So but through all that, it's a kind of a cool space to be in, I think. I mean, because I guess you were drawn to this space, right? As already a person with a real life job and not a brewing job.
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that because Aaron, who's the other full-time brewer at Floodland, and I were driving by Elysian Fields just yesterday, and there's been so much construction around there, and that whole area has been completely rebuilt. Right, they tore down the viaduct, and everything looks different. And I was kind of marveling at it. And we drove by, and I was like, "Hey, I worked in this building," and I had flashed back to it, and I'd completely forgotten that for a couple of years I sat at this desk and I looked out the window and I looked down at your brewery that you ran, Elysian Fields. And I would turn around and look out and I could see into your brewery. And
With or without binoculars.
Yeah. Next question. And I was a home brewer, like, and not a sort of casual home brewer. Like I had a commercial warehouse that I rented with 3 friends. I had, a homebrew system that had an HLT and tri clamps and pumps and stuff. Like I was like a long time serious homebrewer. And had been writing business plans and thinking about whether or not I should quit my job and start a brewery for years. And one of the things that definitely motivated me was I spent, I don't know, it must have been 18 months. And I looked out and I could see your brewery right there. And every day I had to turn around and then do my work at my computer. And it was like, it highlighted how soul crushing and repetitive my job was. And it's obviously, it's like, it's really easy to romanticize working in a brewery. Working in a brewery is like a pretty manual labor job. It's pretty repetitive. But I would, sometimes I'd go grab a sandwich at Tats and I'd walk back to Legion Fields. I'd walk back, or, at the end of the day, I'd kick off and I'd go drink Bobble and Bibelot, or I would go drink, Mango Unchained, or any of these like incredible beers that you had brewed. And I just remember thinking like, holy shit, who is this guy? Who is this brewer who's brewing here? Why is everybody in the city not talking about how this is the best beer in the city? And then a couple of years later, everyone was, once you opened Cloudburst and the sort of secret was out. But I felt like I'd stumbled onto the inside track at the time, which is crazy. And I didn't even remember this story until yesterday. Like, it didn't figure into the calculus of asking you to be the guest on this. And I don't know if you and I have ever even talked about that, but there was definitely a strange aspect to me being a brewer that definitely was in part due to you.
Wow. That's wild. I mean, we've only really talked about, what was it, Bibelot, when Laurel was HBC 291 and you had that pale ale, and the quest for that Laurel continues every year of like, where was this straw? Like, it was such like red strawberry.
So tell the story about those two beers and what they were about, and then how that transpired with us over the years.
So yeah, those Elysian Fields, it was like a little 7, it was a 10 heck, but really it was kind of an 8 to 7 barrel brew house. And it was kind of like the experimental playground at Elysian. So anytime we got new hops, new ingredients, it was like, let's make a 7-barrel batch of something. And I think that year those were 2 pale ales. One hop turned out to be Equinaut and one hop turned out to be Laurel. And it was kind of like, let's make the same base recipe, highlight these hops, like see what they're all about. And that beer that had Laurel in it was just so it's more surprising looking back on it, because Laurel has evolved into kind of like this new noble hop that I think people like to kind of sell. I mean, I've had some really nice IPAs with Laurel in them. Scotty from Balter in Australia, I think he puts Laurel in all of his hazy IPAs, and his hazy flagship definitely has some Laurel in there. And it is like this kind of soft floral, a little bit of like stone fruity hop, but the Laurel that we were playing around with back then was like bright strawberry, like raspberry Hawaiian fruit punch. Like it was so not Laurel today.
And then there was a point where once Laurel was named and out, I got some and I brewed with it. And I remember I had this, like, I was haunted by that beer that you made with it and how good it was. And I went to you and I asked you about it. And you had a story about having been at Selection, right?
Yes. Yeah. They brought out some Laurel. We don't select for Laurel. We're still so small. So it's like our selection is still kind of, it's shared with 2 other breweries. And it's really just for Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe. But they had brought out 2 lots of Laurel just for some feedback on them. And one of those lots of Laurel was like sparked that same exact memory. And I was like, oh my God, this is the Laurel. This is the lot. And then when we kind of dug a little bit deeper, they're like, well, it doesn't matter. We're blending both of these lots anyways. And you're like, oh my God, but like, that's where it was. I mean, I think there might be 3 farms that grow Laurel now. It's always been Loftus and Peralt, and Carpenter might grow a little bit of it too. But I think those are kind of like the main 3. And so when you have a hop variety that has, that in that particular case, like, what made that Laurel so different from the other Laurel on the table? There's so many different variables that you probably know more about the T word, terroir, than I do. Um, but yeah, that laurel still exists out there. But then if it gets blended away because there's a hop variety that just they need X many pounds of it, and they need to blend these lots versus have separate lots, we may never see it again.
Did you see it coming back then that your job was going to be so much about having these close relationships with hop growers and delving into the nuances of different lots and different varietals and harvest pick times?
Ooh, I didn't really necessarily see it where it is now, but I really did once we started getting our hands on some experimental varieties. And at Elysian back then, it was mostly YCH varieties, experimental varieties. That was really exciting to me. I really wasn't kind of in the know as far as like how hop breeding and hop development was kind of going, and then kind of that little door opened and you're like, oh my god, this is so much more complicated than it kind of appears on when they're pelletized and at your brewery. So from there, that door opened and like I kind of ran with it. I just keep finding it still so interesting, every year, every harvest. And similar to you, where it's like I mean, it's so odd. We've always talked about like, you know, wine wine is sometimes easier to make than beer, at least from the perception, because you have these vintages, right? So it's like it can be different because this is a different harvest, and like it doesn't have to really be anything like the last year's version. Where in the craft beer world, when people have these flagships, like those beers can't really deviate at all, despite having different barley and different hops, harvest years, and like things like that. So um, I think it's kind of one of those things that we both have talked about, where like you're dealing with a lot of fruit harvest, and I mean you also have a lot of unknown variables as far as the process of your beer is going. But hops trying to kind of get that same expression per variety every year is such a challenge, I feel like, to me. And I think it's a challenge to a lot of brewers that are selecting hops for like flagship beers.
Because I mean, one of the things that goes on with brewers like you is that you're making such an agricultural product that's so deeply tied to the seasons and to the harvest, but you're being held to this standard of old school mentalities about beer, where beer is supposed to be this static, stable shelf product, right? Like it, it's supposed to be like a can of beans, right? Like people expect that they grab it in December and it tastes the way that it should taste when you grab it in July. And obviously we have these like predecessor breweries, you look at Allagash and breweries like Sierra Nevada, who through an enormous amount of effort and intellect and harnessing technology were able to create massively shelf stable beers. Like you could go get Sierra Nevada Pale Ale at you could be in Kentucky at a gas station, you get Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and it tastes like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is staggering, but also sets a bar that isn't realistic for smaller breweries, right? I think
Yeah.
that it's interesting how, as different as the beers that Cloudburst makes from the beers that Floodland makes, is that both of us are deeply tied to that agricultural season. Do you think that's about us as people, or do you think it's something about being in the Northwest where like all these hops are grown and where we're surrounded by agriculture?
Oh, it's got to be a little bit of both, right? I mean, like if we were making beer in Iowa, I mean, I like to think that like whatever our beer styles are, clearly, like, we're both making beer styles that we're passionate about, and that should kind of like flow into your ingredient sourcing, regardless of where you are situated in the country. But in the Northwest, yeah, I mean, like that Eastern Washington, just ag scene it's just so close that like it becomes so accessible, kind of the same way that like when your passion shows for like this thing and you start getting excited about like, you know, varieties of apricots and plums and things, that like it's like I still think that like there are three types of plums that I know, and then I go, try one of your beers, or go to the farmer's market and try some jam, and you're like, oh my god, there's like 12 different plum jams. all sourced in Washington. Like it's mind blowing. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that in Seattle, we live in this bubble where there's like an enormous number of people who go to farmers markets and who maybe are like pretty food centric. And so you have this sense where there's a lot of people here who are pretty tied into that sense of the changing seasons, and that, that it's weird to be able to eat avocados 12 months out of the year, right? Like that's not really like a supernatural thing. It's pretty weird. And I think that because that people get it, right? Like I know that one of the things that weirded me out after I was really deep into beer was getting used to fresh hop beers here and then going other places in the country. And I remember my wife is from Indiana, and we were in Indiana right around fresh hop season, and I went to a brewery, and the bartender there was like, "Oh yeah, we got this fresh hop beer." And I had to, like, my wife looked at me and she was like, "Do not," and I was like, "All right, I don't like, how do you explain this to someone?" And I think the fresh hop scene has changed dramatically, but you're like, at this point, I was like, I've driven a car full of fresh hops back from the farm when, my buddy that I brew with has already mashed in and is waiting. And we're like, I got the windows open so I don't choke on CO2 and stuff. Like, I've made fresh hop beers, like with no pellets, all entirely fresh hop, driven from the farm, not shipped. Like we were, like you text them and they're picking the hops that morning. So then you go somewhere else and you're like, we start to realize how fortunate that we are to live here. And that's like, so this is something where regionally we're able to do things that people in most places of the world can't. And then even for Washington, how intense it is here, you're like, you've gone to the farthest reaches of that, right? You've gone to the edge. Like you obviously saw a path and just fell in love with fresh hop beers, because I don't think anyone in the world done fresh hop beers the way that Cloudburst has. I'm not aware of any.
I mean, they're getting that's. I mean, there are breweries now. I think 10 years ago, like, I mean, brewing a fresh hop beer at like a Legion was like kind of this like novelty-ish thing. Now, yeah, there are like, a couple breweries in Yakima, Single Hill, especially, like they have a fantastic grasp on almost every farm in the valley, every variety difference per those different farms. There's the access that you kind of can start to like nerd into is like, okay, like where are they located in the valley, and what type of picking equipment do they have, and what are their kilns like, and what are their, like, how are they processing it, who's the one palletizing it once it's baled up, and like there's just endless amounts of variables for you to really kind of like dork out on. But I mean, like, yeah, for the fresh hop side of things, I think we've probably brewed the most fresh hop beers every harvest, like in our tenure. We're averaging like 10 a season, and that's going on eight seasons now. So that's 80 80 beers with fresh hops that we make really no money on because of how much more expensive they are as far as like time and like, usage and like things like that. But if anybody can be, that idiotic about fresh hop beers, we should be the king of the idiots. So
Why?
I think because I really give a shit about it. Like I really fucking love wet hop beers. And so like, if you're not doing it, if you're doing it and you're not in love with it, then like why are you putting yourself through like this 6-week period where it's like, I don't see my wife very much. I'm like, you're you're in your house for like 6 hours total, during the week, just to basically like collapse on a bed and get up again and like make that beer. So you better really enjoy what you're doing with that. And I do. And I think that there's always something still surprises me. Like you learn something new every harvest. A new variety might come out of nowhere and be like, wow, that's really cool. Like I want to use this more. Or you go to a new farm and you see, it's just like, there's just so many fun like angles and dimensions during harvest. So the hops are great too, but it's all the other things too that is kind of makes that experience worthwhile.
Yeah, what do you think of with that, with your relationship to farmers? Is that, how important is that to you?
It's too, I mean, like it's everything as far as like fresh up beers go. Like every harvest, you get a few like emails from brewer friends being like, "Hey, how do I get fresh hops?" And it's like, well, it's like, I don't know, drive out there and like, or email a farm and like see what they're doing. Like, you've got to have some initiative, to kind of make these connections. And so, I mean, yeah, at first it's just like, all right, you're like, it's brewer and farmer, and you're kind of bridging, the ingredients together, and you're putting a face to a name. But then you really kind of get to like look into like how they run their operation. Like these are large operations, right? So it's like they they're going to have a tough year. Like this harvest is like pretty tough, and so it's kind of one of those things where you kind of get to kind of see like, oh man, like we might, I think your model and our model are kind of similar, where we're intentionally like not growing very much, and so like we're fairly well insulated to like this ebbs and flows of just like cyclical like business style things. But agriculture is not, and like if you have this agricultural product that's like 99% of its usage is linked to this one industry, and this industry isn't doing so hot, right now, especially the big players who have all, 2 to 4 year contracts on the books. And they say, you know what, we had that contract because we were projecting 2% growth and we're down 5%. And we don't need those 500,000 pounds of hops on our contract this year. It's like, it gets kind of tricky fast. And so I think having a relationship with the farmers at least puts some of that stuff into perspective, where, it's like they're really tied to craft beer, and all this kind of doom and gloom the last couple of years now affects a whole nother industry that's critical to craft beer's existence, as well.
And when it comes to hop farms and dealing with these fresh hop beers, I mean, I think like you're saying, this is not a profitable game for breweries to be making these beers. You're talking about an enormous amount of extra effort to brew these beers on top of what's already thin margins for a brewery. It's got to be the same for farms, right? Like they're not making money off of harvesting, right? Like this is a large industrial operation that requires, things need to be smooth, right? They're harvesting enormous amounts of hops to stop and pull wet hops for a brewery. They've got to essentially be losing money doing that, right?
It's such a pain in the butt for some of them. Like, yeah, I mean, like you kind of like figure out what the farms need and do everything you can to help. And the last 5 years, like a lot of farms have figured out a way to like just divert belts from their picker with cleaned hops to like figure out a way to like, how do we get this belt in an area where someone can just like, put a 50-pound bag and collect hops as quickly as possible. So like they're getting really good at like logistics as far as picking up hops go. But right, someone is taking time out of their day, like overseeing acres of hops going through this facility constantly, and then be like, oh, like someone just showed up, like let me go get them a bag of 100 pounds of this thing while all this other chaos is like going around them. And yeah, it's like, I mean, that's it's why you bring them beer and have a smile on your face like every time you show up, right? It's just like I've talked to a few friends. They're like, you know what? They actually don't mind it now because it's just like you lift your head up for like, even if you're lifting your head up for 10 minutes, and it's like, okay, like get me out of this picker. Like let's go get Steve Hops, and like let me have a conversation with someone like not on the farm for like 10 minutes, and then it's like, all right, back to the grind. But yeah, it's a pain in the butt. I mean, sometimes I definitely like feel bad pulling up to a farm, and you can see like something's not going well for them. But it's the same way. It's like, sometimes you show up at a brewery. Like today, I had a horrible canning run today, and I had to tell someone who was going to swing by. I was like, just please don't come in right now. Like I'm troubleshooting like 7 things. Like I just don't want to see anyone. And like it's from the hop farmer standpoint, things too. Like you can kind of read the room and be like, I'll come back, or like I'm so sorry that you have to like deal with this crap. But I think the fact that we're always in the same kind of we're always in that same world enough that like we all get it when like shit's not going the way you want, and like uh and trying as hard as you can not to be a pain in the ass.
We are going to take a short break for this message and then come right back for more of this conversation with Steve Luke of Cloudburst Brewing.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. First Tea has ginger for the gingerbread stout, or try a porter or brown ale with ginger, vanilla, and cinnamon. Looking for other seasonal ideas? You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Welcome back. I want to shift gears a little bit away from IPA. I think that one of my favorite things locally is Cloudburst's lagers. And I think you guys get a lot of talk about your IPAs, and in a city that drinks a lot of lager, Seattle doesn't really have a lager focused brewery, but in my opinion and for my tastes, your lagers are my favorite thing to drink in Seattle. I want to know, as someone who's been around for a bit and has seen things come and go, what are your thoughts about the recent lager resurgence?
Ooh, well, thank you, Adam. Those are very kind words for an IPA brewer. Yeah, I think the lager resurgence has been, I think most brewers will tell you they're happy to see, more Pilsners, more contemporary, like American lagers, like slightly hop forward versions of like, macro lagers. Because I feel like that was such a brewer driven like demand that kind of led into opening up the supply side of that. I felt like for the last 10 years in, random articles and interviews, it was like, well, what are you drinking? And it's like, the brewer's always like, I'm drinking the Pilsner, I'm not drinking the IPA, I'm drinking the Pilsner. So it just took like a while for people to say like, well, maybe I should be drinking what the brewer is going to be drinking, like when they're done with their shift. But that said, I mean, like I was just on a panel last week at the Craft Beer Summit of Washington. That does Shauna still work at Floodlands? Yeah, so Shauna kind of arranged the days, and so we kind of had this like 3-person lager panel with myself, Nate Crane from Chuckanut, and then John Marty from Lowercase, who is making a bunch of lagers too of late, to kind of just like do like a 60-minute like tips and tricks and like Q&A, because there's a lot of mediocre lagers out there right now, right? Like it's like if I see a Pilsner from a brewery that I haven't heard of or haven't had much beer from, like I kind of go in with it. I kind of go in with it with like low expectations, I guess. Do you find that too? Like just that there's more out there, so that means there's more mediocrity out there inherently?
I mean, I think that is a microcosm of the general craft beer movement, right? Like I mean, I found that as the years go by, and I have a harder time turning off my ability to be critical when drinking beers, that I have a harder time finding beers that I can drink that I enjoy at all. Also, for me, like while I am enormously grateful for the resurgence in lagers, I think that hoppy beers in general have moved away from my palate, and I think that one of the most concerning developments in beer is the move away from brewer driven trends toward consumer driven trends. I think that more and more breweries are pandering to people with, you know, the sort of milkshake beers and pastries beers. They're being driven by like lowest common denominator palettes. Whereas I think what the scene that you and I had our roots in was a lot of people saying, man, American beer is bullshit. I went to England and the beer there was incredible. Or American beer is so boring. I went to Germany and the beer there was so incredible. And they wanted to bring all these beers back that they loved. And it was very brewer driven. Brewers being like, what's being made right now is not good. We can make better. And that was what led to this explosion in craft breweries. And I think that the lager resurgence fascinates me because it is the only trend that I can think of in recent years that runs counter to that, where brewers clearly were at the root of it, which I didn't lead you on that. And you said exactly what my experience was, which was this was years and years of brewers all being like, well, we just drink pills. Like we want this, we want lager because it's so refreshing. Right. And a lot of the really good ones tend to be pretty dry and pretty hoppy and pretty bitter, which gets back to some of the roots of what was different about the original craft breweries from what was being made, was that the beers were more bitter. And so on a day-to-day basis with our sort of like sales and what we see in the market and trends and stuff, my constant frustration as a beer drinker is that I see so many breweries that seem like they're just brewing what people want rather than brewing what they want to brew. And my take, hot take, I guess, is that if you don't have better taste than most consumers, you shouldn't be running a brewery. Like the goal for us has always been to brew what we like. And that if that speaks to people, we can bring people along for like on a journey, right? Like we can elevate what people are into or get them into the niche things that we're into. And I kind of feel like if I get to the point where I'm posting like, what should we brew next, guys, on Instagram, that I'm gonna go get a job at Amazon, man. Like like that's it. That's the end for me. So I think that's like, I wonder things, and you're way more tapped into what's going on currently, and I wonder like, why doesn't Seattle have a lager brewery? Why doesn't Seattle have a Chuckanut or a Heater Allen, right? Like we have these geographically north of us, south of us, we have these really really exceptional lager breweries, but no one here does. Like there's no brewery like that here. There is no, what I'm saying?
I guess like, I mean, someone would have to really, those breweries that you mentioned, like that's their thing, but it's kind of always been their thing. And I think it's hard for people to open up a brewery in the last 10 years that want to do more than 300 barrels, 500 barrels, to not be able to do a few different styles. I mean, at this rate, you could do everything lager just fine. Something hoppy, something dark, something light, something crisp, bitter. Like lagers allow for that. Will people be able to factor in like, the added capital that you need for maybe different types of equipment to make a better lager? Will they factor in 8 weeks tank time? I mean, having a beer sit in a tank for 8 weeks is not good business. I mean, we do it anyways, but that's 2 to 3 turns on a single tank that we could be making more beer on. So you really just have to, it takes someone getting more creative, I think, to really open a brewery in Seattle. It's like, we're just going to do lager beers. and we're going to be really dogmatic about it, and we're going to, it's kind of like opening a distillery in Seattle, right? It's like, well, you're not going to be profitable until year 5, 7, 10 if you're lucky, because the first 3 years you're just filling barrels and maybe making some really crappy vodka, to go along with it, or gin. But I think I think logistically it's hard. It's hard to kind of open out of the gates with a concept like that. Um, do you think so too? Like,
I mean, do people come to you and ask you for advice about starting breweries? Because that's what my response is going to be.
yeah.
And I think, yeah, what do you say when someone comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm thinking about starting a brewery"? Or usually what they say to me is, "Hey, I'm starting a brewery," and then they have a follow-up question. What do you say to those people?
I mean, like, well, to kind of backtrack a tiny bit, one of the questions on this panel last week was, what if I only have 4 weeks to make a lager? And it was like, then just don't make one.
Don't make a lager. Yep.
But or advocate for yourself and your brewery to get 6 or 7 weeks, and then give it a go. So what would you just say before that? Where are we going with this? Oh yes, opening a brewery from scratch. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't.
I would say, in general, I don't advocate for anyone to open a brewery, in part because I think that if someone telling you don't start a brewery is going to dissuade you, then you're not going to be able to open a brewery. Like if me, just some chucklehead, telling you, "Hey, don't start a brewery, that's a bad idea." If that influences your opinion at all, then you needed to be influenced in that way, because the amount of determination that it takes to start a small independent brewery, unless you come from a place of immense wealth and privilege, which some people do, but people like you and I don't, starting a brewery is going to be one of the hardest things that you do in your life. And you're going to run into so many problems and so many challenges that you need to be resilient enough to get past that. If someone's hurting your feelings, slows you down, then you're not going to start a brewery, or at least you're not going to run a brewery successfully once you start it. So in general, I always just tell people no. So, I mean, as much as I, as a consumer, would like for Seattle to have a badass lager brewery that makes a lot of lagers that you can consistently find that are reliable, I wouldn't ask someone to do that or suggest to someone to do that. So, I mean, that's my answer to your question.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to answer the question with a question being like, have you worked in a brewery before?
Yeah.
That's at least like, do you know what you're getting yourself into?
Yeah.
But I know you had
which I knew was stupid at the time. I mean, I knew it was idiotic.
But you had two partners that did, and and your passion was on the weekends in your space as well. So
yeah,
it wasn't like this like pipe dream that you kind of just thought would be a good idea one weekend.
No, for sure. It wasn't like my mom told me that my beer was good and, I had a couple $100,000 burning a hole in my pocket. I was pretty obsessive about it for quite a while. And, happened to have a good friend who was also a really talented brewer who was willing to quit his job first and go, take the plunge while we were sort of planning our brewery, which gave us some insight into what it was going to be like. But I mean, nothing can really prepare you for starting a brewery. I mean, I think that even having worked at a brewery and then started a second brewery, I still made mistakes on my second brewery, right? Like,
right.
And there's things that I know now, like we buy new tanks and I look for different things than I looked for even, 3, 4, 5 years ago. There's a constant learning process, right?
Yeah.
I think that there's more to talk about, and I kind of blew past that brewer-led trends and brewer-led movements within beer styles. Like your experience with this has got to be really different than mine, and I genuinely, I'm not asking this as a question of like I think I know what you're going to say, but what do you guys think about that when you make beers? Do you think about what how much do you think about what other people want or how people are going to respond?
I mean, we don't think we're still so small enough that we don't have to think too hard about that. I mean, like there's still a couple of beers that we'll make and we know they're going to be a hard sell. We've got a spiced winter warmer in the tank right now
Yes, awesome.
because it's like, our special ale from Anchor was one of my favorite seasonals, and there's I wouldn't say there's a need for that. I mean, that's a typical beer where it's like you buy a 6-pack of it, you drink one, you put one in the back of your fridge, you bring a couple of those beers over to your friend's house. They'll drink one, they put one in the back of their fridge. It's like no one's getting rich off of a spiced winter warmer. It's hard enough to sell 15 barrels in our city with that. But I do see some like trends, and some of it's just a matter of like logistics for us and like having to make some like larger decisions. For example, West Coast IPAs are alive and well again in Seattle. So clear, bitter, really fruity and dry IPAs. And when we make them, we kind of always have a 15 barrel tank full of one. It sells really fast. But that's a different yeast that we use on that, for those beers. So for our West Coast IPAs, we're using bricks of 3470 and then warm fermenting lager yeast. So if we were to scale that up into like a double batch of a Cloudburst IPA, it would really mess with the way that we crop and harvest yeast every week to kind of keep our house strain going. And then we've kind of struggled with like, well, what is a Cloudburst? Like we basically say we have Cloudburst IPA and then we have West Coast IPA. And so Cloudburst IPA, which is still dry and bitter, but it is hazy, from hot polyphenols and things like that. We wonder, with this trend of hazy IPA kind of heading downward, at a certain point, do we decide to ramp up more West Coast IPAs at the detriment of like what a Cloudburst IPA is, right? So it's like we haven't had to really get there yet, but I love West Coast IPAs, and I love our regular IPAs, but I can see there's definitely a thirst for more West Coast IPA in Seattle, more so than like a hazy IPA right now. And there's also not a lot of breweries just cranking out West Coast IPAs in this city. So that's like kind of this like 2024 like logistical decision that we're going to have to just like make. Like, should we just lean more into West Coast IPAs, and that's going to then cannibalize our regular IPA, but does that even matter? So that's kind of like the thing that we're looking at. So it's not necessarily like a consumer driven like aspect of it, because I think I still think like a West Coast IPA is going to be pretty assertive and aggressive to like the common, the typical craft beer drinker, that they're going to be like, ooh, I don't know about this. This is like really aggressive. But it is something that like I like making and I like drinking right now. So maybe we lean into it.
Yeah, do you feel like when you brew those, like you guys brew Happy Little Clouds, which is almost like a not to style lager, right? Like
Right.
how much do you think about that in terms of like what your freedom is to bend styles or find gaps between styles? Because I feel like with the lager resurgence, there's a huge amount of that ties into the same sorts of buckets that people put beers in when they talk about a hazy versus a West Coast. But you guys have shown that you're adept at finding things that aren't necessarily traditional and finding profiles that are really cool and profiles that aren't gimmicky at all, but that don't necessarily have to be like, you can brew a lager and it doesn't need to be a perfect BJCP German Pils, right? Like it doesn't need to be. What do you think about that, about brewing those beers not to style?
I think it's important to like have a plan from start to finish about what you want that beer to taste like, and then carry it over into your team, being able to like describe that to someone that's about to order it, so that their expectations, if you have people's expectations accurately kind of dialed in, then I think it's a better response to these kind of beers that we will take, more liberties on. I mean, so what we were canning today and is released tomorrow it's a dry hopped Helles. So it's like, and part of this was because it's Gen 0 yeast. So whenever we get our first pitch of yeast, I've stopped brewing like a traditional lager with it, because it's the fermentation is going to be fine, but it's never going to be as predictable of a profile as I want in most of our lager beers. So when it's Gen 0, it's kind of like, let's do a hoppier version of a lager, just so that if the fermentation isn't like as smooth as we want it to be, like there's hop presence too, kind of a thing. So like this beer was started off like a Munich style Helles. All kettle additions were German Mittelfrüh, but then we threw in some New Zealand peacherine in the whirlpool, and we dry hopped it with Citra Cryo. So like to like a half pound per barrel. So it's like, it's still very subtle. It's not a pale ale per se. It's a Helles base with some like really cool stone fruit hop character to it. And people will see dry hopped Helles, on our menu, and they're going to be like, what is that? And then it's going to be up to a lot of our team explaining to that person, like, this is what this is. This is how this beer started out. This is what this beer tastes like. This is what we're going for with it. Like, please don't judge this up against Augustiner. Like, it's not like that. But if there's no talk about it and someone brings that home, they're going to be like, what the fuck is Cloudburst doing? What is this Helles? This tastes nothing like a fucking Helles. So it's tricky. It's tricky to navigate, I guess.
Those beers that you brew, though, that fall into those sort of in between styles still tend to have a profile that is it tastes like a classic beer. Like if you don't know stylistically exactly what a Helles is, or what the difference between a Helles and a German Pils or Czech Pils, or even much less talking about all the different Czech beers and all the different German beers there are, you would still drink that beer and it doesn't taste like, it tastes like a beer, right? It still has a crisp profile, it's aromatic, it has the hop background, but it seems like you guys have almost intentionally taken advantage of being American brewers and not being held to those sorts of historical standards.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got some more leeway. I mean, we still brew, plenty of traditional style lagers. And there's a few styles that I haven't touched yet, because I want to taste them, like in Germany, to see what we should even be going for, I think the most important thing is like having a vision for this beer and executing it. So if it's like, we've also got a traditional like Bohemian style Pilsner in the tank too, that'll be out in a few weeks after this Helles. So it's like, that's kind of showing, we like having multiple like traditional lagers and like, kind of non-stylistic lagers on tap side by side, I think, just from a brewer's aspect, where you're like, okay, that was this cool little hoppy Helles, but like, now let me try this Bo Pils that's just like Tettnang and Satz and Weyermann floor malted pills and 7 weeks with 3470 kind of a deal. Like, it's nice having a little bit of both, because I think just from a brewer standpoint of things, like you should be able to make most traditional styles that are done well and like blindly perceived as like, you know what, yeah, this is totally what an ESP should taste like. Like, let's, not like you want to always make an ESP or have it on your taps, but like, I think that's important to like our philosophy at Cloudburst, is like, if it's a traditional style, it should taste like that traditional style.
I noticed earlier when you were talking about using 3470 for West Coast that West Coast, the target has shifted, right? Like at some point, IPAs seemed to split into hazy and West Coast, and West Coast became this thing that has evolved, right? Like West Coast, that 3470 West Coast is not pre-hazy West Coast.
Right.
how do you deal with that, with consumer demand and people wanting beers that maybe where they don't even understand that the difference between the way that it looks and the way that it tastes, right? Like hazy at its, this is a visual descriptor, not a for a style that was really started by a lot of people who are trying to hit a specific flavor, aromatic, textural thing, right? And it became totally confused because people were pouring it on Instagram. You're looking at it and you're like, oh, it's hazy, right? Like, how do you how do you explain to people when you're making beers that are West Coast but have hop haze, or beers that are hazy but are brighter? Like, what's that conversation like? What's that experience like, being as brewer trying to translate your intent through that like filter?
It's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of communicating. I mean, so to us now, I think if you're gonna get semantically, our IPAs have always been West Coast hazy IPAs. They're both. Our IPAs have always been both, and that was a battle for the first 3+ years of our existence. People were like, Cloudburst is making these hazy IPAs, but they're like too bitter and dry. It's like they don't even know what they're doing with like what a New England style IPA should be. And you're like, no, that's not what we're trying to do. Now like people kind of get what a Cloudburst style IPA is. And so then our West Coast IPAs are clear. And I think the expectation now is like, if you see West Coast IPA on a menu, you're like, that should probably be pretty clear. Like maybe there's the tiniest veil of haze, but you should be able to see through that West Coast IPA. Whereas if you just see IPA, you don't really know what you're going to be getting or so. The 3470, the warm 3470, and it's like we use warm bricked 3470 for West Coast IPAs. We use BSI's 3470 lager yeast for our traditional lagers. So we're using like two different 3470s in the brewery. Mostly because it's like one likes, our BSI 3470, like we're fermenting that primary is now starting at 49, and like we're doing a very little bump. We're going like lower and slower than we have been before. Whereas like bricked 3470, we're only getting one use out of that pitch, and that's fermented, almost at 60 to start with a bump up to like 65. So I think most people don't know that our West Coast IPAs are brewed with 3470, but it was a way for us to differentiate our two IPA styles in-house, like way easier. It's like different fermentation profile in addition to like different hopping regimen, and it looks different too. Versus if we were just using our house yeast on the West Coast IPAs too, it'd be like, it just would be too similar of a like total, it'd be too similar of a beer to the current beer we also have. So and so that's kind of like that's helped at least to say like this is this and this is that. But yeah, communicating that to drinkers. Do you think, I mean, from my perspective, and I don't know about you, but like I have seen people are at least slightly better about like putting certain beer styles into boxes than they were 5-10 years ago. I mean, like you kind of, your beers too, right? Like people like to talk about acidity, fruited sour ales and acidity there was like, it was like the acid wars compared to like the IBU wars was going on in like fruited sour beers. So there was this expectation of like, I'm going to buy this fruited sour and like it should scrape the enamel off my teeth, the first sip. But yours aren't like that, right? So did you see any difference as far as like explaining it to drinkers of like what the acidity is like in your beers?
Yeah, that was really challenging early on because I think, especially in the Northwest, some of the more popular breweries making mixed culture beer were making really acidic versions of the style. So my interest was in making lower acid versions. And some of that was, like when we started Holy Mountain, we were brewing a lot of Brett beers that were Brett, Sack, Co-Ferment, Saisons, which to me were like, we came from a background of liking Orval a lot. And then there was an American wave of those sort of Brett Saisons. And those beers obviously are sometimes they're a little more acidic than a just sack fermented beer, but they tend to be pretty low acid relative to mixed culture beers that have bacteria. So I think that there's so much terminology with all of these things, whether it's lager, IPA, mixed culture beers, where even brewers don't use the same terminology. So to expect that a customer understands your terminology is unrealistic. And I find that, like, I think when you were talking about the spiced winter beer, that really rang a bell, because I think that you have this situation where you have this really cool beer. It comes from a background of loving another beer, and you want to explain it to people, and you have to walk a line between teaching them without it coming across as condescending or patronizing. So we struggle with that all the time with education, where I don't really want to be on social media a lot, and I don't really want to be a brewer personality, but I would love to share my thoughts on that with people. It's one of the reasons we use the term saison, rather than, like, sometimes I'll call them wild ales just to help people. But you say mixed culture to people, and most people, their eyes glaze over, right? Like, they don't know what that means. So yeah, that can be really challenging. I think that, terminology can be empowering, but when you get too bogged down in terminology especially with new beer drinkers, or people who are trying to get deeper into beer, or people who could be turned on to beer more, you don't want it to be too pedantic, right? Like, you don't want this to be something where they feel like they need a bunch of reference books to appreciate beer. So I worry a lot about that confusion turning people off, that, like, they'll go somewhere and have something that someone calls a saison, and then they have one of ours and it's totally different. They don't understand that. And I wonder if that's, like, do you see that with people, where their expectation for one of those beers based on other ones they've had doesn't meet? Because you're saying, there's this sense with hazies where you're like, West Coast beers have always been hazy, right? Like, it's a totally unhelpful term to use. Do you find that people come in and that they find that terminology to be confusing? Like, they want a West Coast that fits a very specific profile, and they don't, they either struggle to get over that terminology, or they struggle to embrace the beer in spite of their sort of preconceived notions?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the more common questions still, that I overhear when I'm behind the bar is like, what's your haziest IPA? And our team is really good at saying, like, it just, like, in the quickest, like, layperson's terms possible, like, what do you mean by, well, they all are hazy in appearance, but do you mean, like, softest? Do you mean fruitiest? Do you mean sweetest? Like what, just to kind of match that expectation off the bat, where it's like, let's stop talking about this, what the beer looks like, but, like, then what? They're like, what does that mean to you, kind of a thing. Which is, I think, a lot. I think that requires more, questions from the people pouring the beer than someone that just orders I think, if at this point a customer that's ordering a West Coast IPA knows it's going to be clear, and it's going to be bitter, and it's going to be like, it's going to be resinous and kind of one of those things. So less expectations on that. But yes, it's one of those things, I think, where you deviate from the norm, or you deviate from the largest perception, of a beer style, is where you're going to have some people say, this is cool, but it's not like what I had before. Or you're going to have some people being like, I don't like this because it's not what I expected. People, I think, still have a hard time, like, thinking about something that's different than just having, like, instant reactions, like, based on expectations. Like, if it's something that's not expected, I feel like most people go to, like, I don't like this because it's not what I expected, and not, this isn't what I expected, but, like, let me think about this more, and, like, maybe it's more interesting, or more, more what you actually want.
Well, I'm looking forward to trying the dry hopped Helles. I'm looking forward to trying the spiced winter beer.
I'll drop them both off in a couple weeks with that sweatshirt for you.
Oh yeah, good, good. My sleeveless pink Planned Parenthood t-shirt has been relegated to the dustbin, so I'll take the shirt. Thanks a bunch for doing this. It was good to catch up. I know it's not the same as having a beer in person, but better this than nothing.
That's totally true. It's super fun. And it's kind of full circle because I feel like uh I don't know, I can't speak for John, but maybe he can pop on here. The first time that John, I know an early impression of John's of your beer was when I brought your beer on another one of their podcasts.
Oh God, I was so embarrassed because I hated that beer. It was one of the early beers that we did, and it was really good when it was young, and then it sort of reacidified in the bottle, and I just didn't really like where it went in the bottle. And one of my good buddies is a huge fan of John's podcast, and he's always talking to me about them. And he's always like, why are you on his podcast? Why aren't you on his podcast? And I was like, dude, like Steve brought him one of these beers early on. It was one of our like worst beers, so he probably thinks our beer sucks. Like this is probably why I'm not. For me,
First of all, that wasn't
reason.
true. And Steve, I know we didn't talk about this before, but even though I'm hanging out in the background, I don't show up on this show. I'm like the not so great and less than powerful Oz for this particular program. So but I will say I've had Adam's beers blind several times, and I adore them. I think that they're wonderful. And I do remember that and fondly. And brewers are always their hardest critics. And I'm likely going to cut most of this out of the show.
But it's so funny that we conjured Oz at the end of the show.
I love it.
This is me taking off in my giant balloon right now. Wait, you're getting in the way of Adam doing the last thing he has to do.
Okay.
Steve will be back on the next episode of the show as the host, having a conversation with a brewer of his choosing. That will be on the air in 2 weeks, so make sure you tune in for that. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. I'm Adam Paysse of Floodland Brewing. Thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast.
First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Falling temps and festive seasons are fast approaching, which means now is a good time to develop holiday stouts and brown ales using hibiscus and cinnamon from First Tea. Looking for other new ideas? You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog. Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.